I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Senator Patrick.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Senator Alliance will be supporting this bill. Mr Acting Deputy President, I have a pilot's licence. That's not to say I would recommend anyone fly with me, but I do have them by virtue of the fact that they are perpetual. I don't have current hours up. But what that leads to is some background in relation to some of the things I'm going to say, and that is that when I learnt to fly back in the 80s, I was a bit confused as a submariner, wanting to go underwater and then wanting to fly on the weekends. You could go to just about any airport in Australia and there was a flight school. And you could, you'd go to that flight school and you'd do your pilot training, very, very professional. Well, it was a bit expensive, but nonetheless, that allowed you to learn to fly. And from that, most pilots, they would learn to fly, either get their private licence or they'd get their commercial licence, move on to commercial activities. And it was those pilots that then went into the GA sector, the general aviation sector. And unfortunately, we've reached the situation where, Senator Rice is talking about aircraft not flying to rural areas. They're not flying to rural areas because there are no pilots anymore. There are no planes. And I'll give you some statistics on that shortly, because everyone has been priced out of the market, not because they're unsafe, but simply because of the overburden of regulation that CASA imposes upon general aviation. I'm sure if you put all of the documentations required to fly in the back of your Cessna, it simply wouldn't take off. It would be so heavy. And to be very clear, the United States and other countries have a much slimmer sets of regulation, and they have much more traffic flying in their airspace in much harsher conditions. Australia is blessed in many senses because we always have relatively good weather. We don't have to worry about significant storms or de-icing aircraft before we take off. So we've got a relatively safe environment compared to other nations that have regard to the fostering of the industry, and that has not been happening here, and it hasn't been happening here because of the legislation which requires basically only the consideration of safety. Now, Senator Rice is very correct in saying safety is really important, but it's one factor. If you want to have safe flying with no risk of accident, then don't let anyone fly. That's the extreme position. We've got to find the right balance, and right now the balance has not been struck correctly. GA, General Aviation, is in a perilous state. The Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics did a report in 2015 that showed GA declined 18% from 2010 to 2015. We've had AOPA suggest that this means we've lost about $500 million per annum of economic activity out of the Australian economy. Not to mention the very devastating effect that this has had on regional communities. I've been involved in the inquiry into regional airfares, and we find that one of the contributing factors to high airfares is simply that airlines like Rex and QantasLink can't get pilots. They can't get pilots, and that adds to the cost of people in regional communities flying, even when we've moved into the regular public transport sector. And that flying is the lifeblood of some of these regional communities. It's the way in which people get to education. It's the way in which people get to health. It's the way in which businesses connect. It's the way in which agriculture flourishes. And if you make things so expensive, what then happens is we end up with a doctor decides to leave the town because they can't go back on a regular basis, or it's too expensive to go back on a regular basis to visit family. They leave the town, and then 5 other people decide to leave the town. So it has a flow-on effect on regional communities. So whilst the economy has had 103 quarters of continuous growth, at the same time general aviation had experienced a 34% decline in pilot numbers over 10 years. 34% decline over 10 years. There had been a 35% decline in avgas sales over 10 years, which is an indication of how little people were flying. 18% decline in aircraft hours over 5 years, and a 20% decline in the serviceability of aircraft for a 12-month period, and a 15% decline in maintenance and repair organisations over a 12-month period. I've mentioned some of this is a fantastic feeding or training ground for pilots that go into regular public transport, but we also have the organisations that do pilot training, the organisations that do charter work, the organisation that does testing, that does ferrying, does surveying, does photography, does aerial work. Unfortunately, we're seeing pilots in these regional areas, they're almost becoming extinct. And that is harmful to Australia. It's harmful to our regional communities. And it's not about saying, let's not be safe. It's about, in some sense, reconfiguring CASA so they don't bombard people with regulation after regulation after regulation. We've got this industry in decline, and it hasn't improved since that 2015 report. Indeed, between April 2016 and June of 2017, we saw 15 new certificates of airworthiness issued, but in the same period we've seen 29 certificates of airworthiness cancelled and a further 27 in a state of suspension. So we saw 57 cancelled or suspended certificates of airworthiness, about 4 a month. Okay? It's an industry in crisis. And look, I'm not going to be kind here. I'm going to tell the way it is, the way that the RAC committee, who have received briefings over and over again on the state of general aviation. CASA is basically, or has been, regulating general aviation out of existence. Let me just talk about a new regulation that CASA has recently introduced, and I did move a disallowance, and it's back on the notice paper tomorrow, in relation to community service flights. This is to give you a perspective of what's happening inside CASA. Now, if you don't know what a community service flight is, let me tell you. There are pilots who are willing to give their time and their experience. They are licensed, they are safe to fly, they have a licence that I can jump into an aircraft with and fly off to Kangaroo Island on the weekend if I wanted to, or whatever. They are declared safe to fly, and what they do sometimes is they, through an organisation, normally an organisation that is responsible for making sure everyone meets all of the general requirements, the safety requirements, what they do is they will give their time to fly sick people from remote locations to major centres. So let me give you an example. If you're living in Ceduna and you need chemotherapy, now you can take the 7-hour drive from Ceduna to Adelaide, do the chemotherapy, and then drive back. That's pretty demanding. In fact, it just makes that treatment almost impossible. Under one of these community service flights, Angel Flight in particular, they'll send a pilot out that will pick you up, fly you to Adelaide, and then return you after your chemotherapy. And what happens in that instance the people are not charged. There's no sort of commercial gain made by these pilots. All they get is a bit of assistance in terms of fuel. So a bit of a kick along gives them an opportunity to enjoy the pleasure that they are safely licensed to fly, and they are allowed to assist people. Now, there have been two unfortunate and fatal crashes relating to Angel Flight, one in 2011 in Victoria and one in 2014 in Mount Gambier. People who jumped onto one of these flights and ended up in an air accident, a fatal air accident, and that is truly, truly upsetting. Now, CASA has looked at this, and in fact the ATSB is still looking at the second accident right now. Hopefully we'll see some reports on that shortly. But CASA then came along and introduced some new regulations. Some new regulations about minimum hours, about some maintenance-related stuff to do with aircraft. Initially when they introduced it, they said helicopters can't be involved in these community service flights. We ask why? What was the safety basis for that decision? And very quickly, the instrument was amended, put back to the Parliament, allowing helicopters to fly. And that was within the space of a day or two of advocacy. But if you go back and you look at these new regulations, they're not focused on these accidents and safety. In fact, I've questioned CASA, I've talked to CASA, I've put questions on notice to the ATSB, which I might foreshadow when they get to estimates. They can expect me to send some torpedoes their way. Their answer was quite contemptuous in my view, but we'll have that discussion at estimates. None of the changes that have been made, had they been there back in 2011 or 2014, would have made one bit of difference in relation to these accidents. Not one thing on these new regulations, had they been implemented back when these terrible accidents took place, would have in any way changed the circumstances. So CASA's gone off and had a look at these two flights and decided they must do something. And what they've done is introduced a burden again on the industry that will see some of these flights no longer occur. And once again, it doesn't appear to be about safety. And so when we get to, hopefully in 15 days from tomorrow, 15 sitting days, I'll be asking the Senate, the Chamber, to disallow that particular instrument. I would encourage people, and I'll wander the halls of the building and make sure everyone understands how ridiculous it is. But this is what we face with CASA. CASA, as the industry has been declining, has been building up in its ranks. It's an empire that's grown quite significantly. So I get where you're coming from, Senator Rice, in terms of safety. It is really important, but the words in this bill do not put economics ahead of safety. Safety is still the primary concern of CASA. It just says they must have regard to making sure that we have a vibrant industry. Okay, that's just the usual balance you have when you've got conflicting requirements. But safety is paramount. Safety is paramount, and so there is no problem here. I've read the bill, and indeed, and I've sat in front of many pilots in the last Parliament in the RAC committee, and the industry is dying. You will get your ultimate aim, Senator Rice. There will be no planes flying in GA, and then you'll have ultimate safety in those circumstances. So, and it's not like the airlines will dictate to CASA that they're not commercial if certain regulation doesn't get pulled. That's not what's going to happen here. So I want, as I think most people here want, an efficient and sustainable Australian aviation industry sector, where safety is paramount. It is important, but where CASA does give consideration to industry as it makes rules. That means it doesn't make rules like it is with the Angel Flight rules that are meaningless, add cost, and don't do one thing for safety. CASA has, as I said, has focused on safety to the point of running aircraft out of the skies, to the point where one day we'll have no GA aircraft. All of our pilots will then have to come from overseas. In fact, we've got a situation now where we've got a great environment for people to learn how to fly because of that sort of safe, open skies that we have with very little traffic compared to somewhere like the United States or Asia. Great opportunities, but it appears the only people that can afford to set up schools now are Qantas and Rex and some overseas entities. And we have to change that. And it's in that context that I commend this bill